Well, thank you so much, Connor, and thank you, Intelligence Squared, and thank you so much to all of you coming to join us on this rainy September evening. Dan and I are so thrilled to see you, and I'm so excited to be here interviewing Dan about his fantastic book. I've rather wrecked my copy with scribbles and bookmarks. It is really, I'm going to put it there for the moment, just such a magnificent book. And it's such a privilege to be here interviewing Dan, and there's so many questions I'm going to want to ask him. So the book is out on Thursday officially, but it's already in bookshops, and he's the best-selling author of 15 books. I can't quite believe this, 15 books, including The Plantagenet, The Templars, Powers and Thrones, and these really wonderful novels, Essex Dogs and Wolves of Winter, and I mean, so many of those New York Times bestsellers, Sunday Times bestsellers, and he won't let me say this, I'm going to say this, he's a titan of history, and he's such a great historian, and I just want to say he's so generous to other historians. He's so generous to young historians coming up, early career historians. So the historical community is very lucky to have him. And he's got this great history podcast, This Is History, which was advertised in Leicester Square, and so many TV series, too many to count, but one of my favourites.
If you want, you can keep going. This is all
one of my favourites, I'm sure your favourite is too, is Netflix, The Secrets of British Castles. And here we are talking about Henry V, Dan Snow, master of medieval narrative history, says Dan. Dan Jones writes with pace, wit and insight, says Helen Castor. And how you managed to get all this amazing life in here, it's a stunner. So you've got a lot of questions about Henry V, aren't they? For some, he is, as one of the chroniclers called him, the greatest man to ever rule England. But what you say in your introduction, which is he's fascinating, but he's intriguing and hard to pin down. And there were all these questions of reputation, which we'll talk about much more later. But is he a ruthless warmonger, or is he a king of glory? And Shakespeare has had such an effect on how we see Henry V, hasn't he?
Yes, I suppose if we know, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I could have listened to it all night. Shakespeare's had, of course, a sort of formative and effect on the way we see Henry V, in the same way that Shakespeare really has had a formative effect on the way we view the whole of the 15th century. It's very hard to look at the 15th century without looking through the lens of Shakespeare because of the brilliance of those two tetralogies. From Richard II through, the cycle goes in chronological order from Richard II through to Richard III. And having written, I'd written a book about the Wars of the Roses about 10 years or so ago, and coming back to the 15th century with Henry V, you realise just how much one has internalized like Shakespeare's version of events, which sometimes is tightly and squarely based on history, and sometimes is a total flight of fancy. That being said, what do most people know if they know anything about Henry V? Probably the Battle of Agincourt, because that was so brilliantly dramatized by Shakespeare, and the pudding bowl haircut. I would say the sort of iconic, you have to be quite a hard guy to pull off that haircut. Yeah. In any age of history, I don't care who you are, if you can pull off the pudding bowl, you're tough.
It's the bit at the front as well, isn't it? It's all the way around.
It's the Beatles, Henry V. There's, it's a high bar for pulling off that do. But he is an intriguing king. He's one of the shortest kings. He's one of the kings who rules England for the shortest amount of time in the Middle Ages. Only Edward V, who is never crowned, so rules England for no time, and Richard III, who rules for 2 years and 2 months. Only they, in the whole of the Plantagenet dynasty, the 300-odd years, rule England for a shorter time than Henry V. Yet he has this reputation, and you quoted K.B. Macfarlane, the great 20th century medievalist, of being the greatest man ever to rule England. And so the question you have to sort of have in your mind as you approach Henry as a biographer is, how much of this is hype? How much of this is Shakespeare? How much of this is Agincourt? And how much of it, to look at it the other way, is true? How much of it is it really the case that this guy who ruled for less than 10 years was the epitome of what everyone wanted a medieval king to be?
I mean, it's an astonishing fact, isn't it? Because when you might ask someone, name some early kings before Henry VIII. Most people would probably say William the Conqueror and Henry V. And yet this reign is so short. And also what's so fascinating is that he doesn't have an unalloyed, clear claim to the throne. I mean, he is something of a usurper. So take us back. Who is he? Who is Henry V?
Well, Henry V is born on the 16th of September, 1386, in the gatehouse of Monmouth Castle. And he's born the son of Henry Bolingbroke, who is himself the son of John of Gaunt, the third of Edward III's son. So Edward III, the great 14th century king, has a big brood of children, the third of which is John of Gaunt. His eldest son is Henry Bolingbroke. His eldest son is Henry V. So Henry, the future Henry V. So this young Henry, born in Monmouth Castle, is descended from the great King Edward, but he's nowhere near being in line to inherit the throne.
Because it's the third son.
Because he's the eldest son of Edward III is the Black Prince, and his son ruling England is Richard II. So it seems vanishingly unlikely that this boy born in Monmouth will ever be the king of anywhere. If he's going to be the king of anywhere, it's probably going to be of Castile, because his grandfather, John of Gaunt, has pretenses to that throne. But he is in line to become a great nobleman. The House of Lancaster, the Dukes of Lancaster, who also have 4 other earldoms besides, are the greatest noblemen in England at this time. A huge landed patrimony which stretches not just around Lancaster but across the whole of the country. And Henry Bolingbroke, his father, although a teenager when he's born, is on his way to becoming one of the most famous and most admired noblemen in Europe. I mean, Henry Bolingbroke is the picture of chivalry. He is, in his late teens, early 20s, he's a man who can fight in the lists against Boucicaut, the greatest knight of the day, and be admired for his performance. He's a man who goes out to Prussia and fights on crusade with the Teutonic Knights. He's a man who goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He enters Jerusalem, prays at Christ's sepulchre, something not even Richard the Lionhearted, the great crusader, had managed to do. And he comes back from Jerusalem with a sort of baggage train, including wild animals, an ostrich, a cheetah, these sort of things. So Henry Bolingbroke, father of this young baby Henry, is a great nobleman. His mother, Mary de Bohun, is also of a great noble house. And so this is a sort of an elite couple. And Henry
power marriage.
A power marriage, and Henry is their eldest child. So his future is not likely to be obscure, but at the same time, it's not obvious that he's on his way to kingship. And the very fact that we know he was born on the 16th September 1386 at, to be precise, 11:22 in the morning, is only because much later, after his great military triumphs, astrologers tried to figure out why he'd been so successful, and to do that had to pinpoint his birth to the exact minute. Otherwise, we would never have known these details. So this is who the baby is. His childhood, up till he's 12, 13 years old, is that of most noble children growing up under the reign of King Richard II. He is a member of an elite caste within an England that is tormented by the inadequacies of the ruling king, Richard. So he grows up in a turbulent time. The first sort of crisis of his life comes in 1398, when his father, Bolingbroke, first cousin of King Richard, falls out with the king and is exiled from the realm. And at this point, Henry is sort of dragged personally, as a sort of 12-year-old, into the front line of English politics.
Because his father takes his brother with him, but Henry stays behind, and he's sort of in the orbit of the king. Is that because the king wants to keep his enemies close?
Yes, it is. So, the situation of Bolingbroke's exile from England in 1398 is that dramatised in Shakespeare's play Richard II. He's set against the Earl of Norfolk, Thomas Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Mowbray. They almost fight a duel, and then Richard exiles them both. When Bolingbroke goes into exile, he takes his second son. So Bolingbroke has 4 sons: Henry, Thomas, John, and Humphrey. And
his wife has died by now, hasn't she?
That's
died
right.
in
Mary de Bohun
childbirth.
dies in childbirth, having their 6th child, a daughter. So Bolingbroke goes into exile. He goes to Paris. He takes the second son, Thomas, with him. And this I think, leaves a lingering suspicion for the rest of Bolingbroke's life that his favourite son might be Thomas. He leaves Henry behind, but he has to leave Henry behind because he is the heir to this duchy, and he may well need to be around. Richard then goes off to Ireland to attempt to subdue Ireland, to subdue rebellions and spread nail down English royal control in Ireland. And he takes with him the young Henry. He takes him with him, yes, effectively as security against Bolingbroke coming back. It's a form of being an honourable hostage. But he treats Henry rather well. He knights Henry. Richard goes on campaign in Ireland, and before a sort of minor skirmish, he publicly and in front of all the other knights and warriors of the army, he dubs Henry a knight. Just as the great King Edward III had dubbed his father, Richard's father, the Black Prince, on the start of the campaign, the Crecy campaign in 1346. And this is a great honour to bestow on the child. When the news breaks that Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt dies, Richard disinherits him and refuses to allow Bolingbroke in exile to take his Duchy of Lancaster. When the news arrives that Bolingbroke is coming back to claim what's his, Richard could have done any number of things to young Henry, his hostage. I mean, Richard was not beyond killing nobles of his own realm. He'd done it. He'd killed his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, ordered his murder. He'd beheaded the Earl of Arundel. But he doesn't. He treats the young Henry rather well. He says, he brings him to his presence and says, effectively, did you know this was going to happen? Young Henry goes, search me. This is my dad's business, not mine. And Richard says, well, okay, then, fine. If you didn't know, you didn't know. Nothing you could do about it. Sends him off to Trim Castle for safekeeping, but doesn't mistreat him. And Henry remembers this. Henry remembers this. Even as his father, Bolingbroke, invades England, captures Richard, seizes the throne, formally deposes Richard in Parliament, and takes the throne himself as Henry IV. Even as this rivalry of cousins comes to its head, you'd have thought that perhaps the young Henry would take his father's side, but he's much more ambiguous about it all of his life. And I think he, in part, remembers that when Richard had a chance to do him ill, when he was a sort of 13-year-old, a 12-year-old actually, quite a formative age, he didn't do it. And Henry, in a strange way, whilst appreciating that Richard II was a baleful, terrible, useless, hopeless king, there is no getting around that fact, still honours his memory personally in ways which will be quite politically important.
Yes, I mean, we won't jump ahead too much, but one significant thing he does when he comes to the throne is he buries Richard where he wanted to be buried. Absolutely, and that's a significant act of political reconciliation, which we can talk about in due course. Yes. So Bolingbroke seizes the throne, 1399, becomes Henry IV. He does. And then our Henry is now the heir to the throne, Prince of Wales, but very soon, it's not Henry IV doesn't suddenly say, right, I'm king, and that's it. There are all kinds of contests towards him from his circle, and also Wales. So Owen Glyndwr, my countryman, sees an opportunity. My countryman too. Yes, so Henry IV takes the throne in 1399. In 1400, Richard II is murdered, probably starved to death, maybe smothered in Pontefract Castle. Unfortunate end, to be starved to death. Yes. Yes, not a nice way to go. I mean, the trouble is we don't know exactly how Richard II is killed. There doesn't appear to be any major obvious violence because his body is displayed. But then again, the same was true of Edward II, and depending on what you believe, Edward II was either smothered with a feather bed, strangled, or died with a plumber's soldering iron inserted where you wouldn't really want one inserted anywhere, but particularly in this place for Edward II. So, look, there are ways of killing kings without leaving major visible trace. But be that as it may, Richard II is murdered in the year 1400, and Henry Bolingbroke is now King Henry IV. He has a significant number of problems on his plate, even though the usurpation of the throne, the deposition of Richard II was politically inevitable from the moment Bolingbroke invaded. It was politically desirable because Richard had proven completely incorrigible king, a king who had absolutely no conception of what the job involved and interpreted it as being a private lord who would just stamp on anyone who challenged his authority. I mean, the opposite of
of responsible public leadership. Be that as it may, there was, as Shakespeare shows us in kind of moral dramatic terms, there's a sort of great tear in the fabric of the universe when you depose a king, when the whole of your political system is based around kingship. So Henry lives with both the kind of the growing moral awareness that he's done a bad thing, but also the practical political consequences of the usurpation. This is Henry IV, all his reign. And from 1399, 1400 onwards, he has to deal with those. So he has some practical problems in that he has a number of kingmakers who've helped put him on the throne. Much as Edward IV would have Warwick the kingmaker, Henry IV has Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, Hotspur, another Henry Percy, his eldest son. They've helped put Henry IV on the throne, and they figure they're due a big reward for it. And no reward will, as it turns out, be great enough for them, as he would. He has, as he rightly mentioned, a massive revolt in Wales, led by Owain Glyndŵr, who, on young Henry's 14th birthday, declares himself the Prince of Wales. Now, Henry IV takes the throne. He makes his eldest son, our Henry, to use your useful phrase, Prince of Wales, Duke of Aquitaine, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester. Owain Glyndŵr says, I'm actually Prince of Wales. So now you have a direct challenge. And it's issued on Prince Henry's birthday, just so you can't miss the fact. So Henry IV, being king and having a number of sons and needing to train them up and also having to respond to this challenge, sends Henry off to Wales to cut his teeth, effectively. He sends him to Wales, he sends his brother Thomas to Ireland, he sends his brother John up north. But our Henry has to go to Wales. He's surrounded by governors, by wingmen, by responsible adults who are going to teach him the ways of war, but he goes to Wales to cut his teeth as a prince, defending and winning back his own principality from Owain Glyndŵr. What does that mean? It means he has to learn very quickly, the hard way, while still a teenager, what to do when a territory that's supposed to be yours has been taken from you and is in complete uproar. Welsh castles are being seized by rebels. There's a principality-wide tax revolt. English officials are being driven out of their offices and in some cases taken hostage or even killed. It's chaos. And young Henry, as I say, with responsible adults around him, has to figure out what to do. So that means learning how to besiege a castle, how to deploy the latest military hardware of the day, cannon, how to figure out a good ratio between men-at-arms and archers, when you're in the field, how to raise the money to pay for it all. And that is almost the hardest thing of all. You've got to work out how to beg and grovel to Parliament, English parliaments, to stump up some money to support you, how to beg and grovel to nobles to lend you some money, how to sort of beg and grovel to your men who are supposed to be fighting when they haven't been paid for 2 or 3 months and are on the point of deserting, how to keep morale high. These are tough lessons to learn when you're 13, 14, 15 years old. But Henry learns them. And more than that, he absolutely loves it. Like, he loves it. And you can tell that. There's a great letter he writes back to his father, Bolingbroke, when he's about 15 years old, from Wales. And I'll paraphrase. It's in French, unlike the letters he would later write home in English. He writes, paraphrase in translation, Dear Dad, hope all's well. You sent me here to get after Owain Glyndŵr. Well, I heard him putting it about that he wants a fight. So I went and looked for him, but I couldn't find him. So I went round his house, and he wasn't in, so I burned his house down. Then we went round his other house. Oh, Christ. And he wasn't there, but some of his mates were there, and they said, oh, please don't kill us. And they offered us loads of money, so I cut their heads off. Hope all's well. Praise be to God, lots of love, Henry. He's 15. Now, this letter just sort of bubbles with the love for the job he's been given to do, which is the job of being a warrior prince. From a very early age, he's just temperamentally suited to this sort of thing.
I mean, you write so brilliantly in the book about the organisation of war and the money section and having to borrow money from so many people and how everything he learned in Wales he reused in France. and take us through the Battle of Shrewsbury, because this is a pivotal moment in Henry's life, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And so at this point that young Henry is learning the ways of war in Wales, he's learning a lot of what he knows from Hotspur, who I mentioned already. Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, the man first to the barricades, more his father's age than our Henry's, and with a similar reputation to Bolingbroke as a great knight, a really serious chivalric figure, somebody who's been at the front line and you can rely on in a fight. But he's a member of the Percy family, and they as Henry IV's reign goes on, they start to accumulate grievances and start to feel that they're really not getting their just deserts. And Hotspur gets really fed up with babysitting, effectively, in Wales. One thing leads to another. In the summer of 1403, the Percys, along with a sort of disaffected rump of Richard II's supporters in Cheshire, where Richard had traditionally drawn his most ardent supporters from, rebel against the Lancastrian crown. They initially claim that Richard II isn't dead and they've got him, they're going to put him back on the throne. That quickly becomes evidently not true, and so the rallying call that goes up is just get rid of the Lancastrians, full stop. So on the 21st of July 1403, this comes to a head in pea fields outside Shrewsbury, when an army, a rebel army led by Hotspur and Thomas Percy, his uncle, clashes with a royal army led by Henry IV, the Earl of Stafford, and commanding the rear guard, a 16-year-old future Henry V. A brutal and bloody and dismal battle that prefigures the brutal and bloody and dismal battles of the Wars of the Roses, which will follow much later in the century. Why is it so bloody and brutal? Because both sides have longbowmen. Mm-hmm. Now, in the 100 Years' War, the great weapon of the English on foreign fields had been longbowmen. Archers trained from childhood to draw a longbow. Has anyone attempted to draw a longbow? Impossible, unless you've trained for years and years and years. You need this incredible back strength.
Yeah.
It's not shouldered, it's back just to open this thing, this deadly weapon. It's not like the AR-15 of the 15th century that any idiot can pick up and just point and blast. It's a deadly weapon.
It's a skill.
But when you've got loads of longbowmen, as both sides do at Shrewsbury, it's carnage, because, for obvious reasons, it's carnage.
And their range is about 200 meters that some of them can shoot.
Huge range, incredible penetrative force. I mean, a really horrible, nasty weapon, which is great if you've got it on your side, but very bad if the other side has it, and even worse if both sides have it. So what happens at Shrewsbury is at some point during the sort of melee, the chaos of this battle, young Henry, 16 years old, makes a rookie error. He either removes the helmet he's wearing, or he opens the visor, perhaps to take a drink. We don't know. But it's not really that important. What is important is that an arrow shot from a longbow straight into his face. It's either that side of his nose or that side of his nose. We're not sure. What we are sure about, because we have the surgeon's notes from John Bradmore, the surgeon who operates on him, is that the arrow goes into his skull to the depth of 6 inches, like handspan, and the arrowhead lodges at the back of his skull inside. He or somebody else pulls at the arrow shaft, and these things are designed to come apart easily so that the arrowhead sticks in you, and you, a la Richard the Lionheart, get blood poisoning if it hasn't killed you immediately. What you would do if you'd been shot with a longbow and it was in a sort of fleshy part of the body was you'd push the arrowhead out the other side. But you can't do that in your head. So there's a big problem. It's said that Henry fights on for a little while. I mean, shock is an amazing thing, so perhaps he does. But soon after the battle is won by his father, he's carried off to Lancastrian HQ at Kenilworth Castle, and everyone scratches their heads and goes, oh no, the heir to the throne has an arrowhead, an 1 ounce lump of metal stuck inside his head, about that far from his brain.
And he's going to die, that's what
he's going to die. He's going to die. Or is he? Well, there's one surgeon in England at this time who thinks he might be able to save him, and it's a guy called John Bradmore. Bradmore is retained by the king. He is already a well-known and famous servant. He's performed incredible operations. He's, for the time, or for any time really, He's operated on a carpenter who slipped with a chisel and opened an artery. He knows how to cauterize arteries. He's operated on Henry IV's master of pavilions, who's attempted suicide by running into a wall holding a dagger in his guts. He's sewn up, ruptured intestines and stopped the guy from dying of blood poisoning, besides the blood loss. He's even done blepioplasty, eye bag surgery. He's done plastic surgery, and he has ointments and unguents of his own devising, which are good for scarring. And I'll come on to why I think
he does medieval Botox and everything.
He's the man, right? And so he's the guy you call if the heir to the throne has got an arrow stuck inside his head. And Bradmore comes up to Kenilworth, and he says in his notes about we still have his notes from the operation. He says,
"That's astonishing that you still have those notes."
I was pretty worried. And his biggest fear, he says, is interesting. I mean, he's got the sort of arrogance of the surgeon in any age, which you need, I think, to be a successful surgeon. He says, I was mainly worried about the spasm. He was worried he was going to go into toxic shock. But he said, I knew how to deal with that. The operation he has to perform is, I'm afraid, for anyone who's squeamish in the room, quite a grisly one. He has to open the entry wound such that it's bigger than the barbed bit of the arrow. And that takes some time. He puts little plugs of linen wrapped in a sort of gauze-type material into this wound and opens it and opens it and opens it. But he knows he has to keep it clean. So he uses honey and he uses sort of white wine, basically.
Really?
Good inside the body and out. And but he knows whether he has germ theory or not. He knows that this is a way to keep a wound clean, and that's very important. So they keep the wound clean. He opens it by degrees over a number of days. He has designed a bespoke tool, I guess a little like a speculum. It's got what it's going to do is it's going to go inside the bit where the arrow shaft had been in the arrowhead, open like that so it can clamp it, and then he's going to draw the arrowhead slowly out of the wound. He does that. Then he clicks, still keeping the wound clean and still constantly, keeping Henry's head still and warm so he doesn't go into shock or spasm. He closes the wound up, presumably sews it shut, and then heals it. Now, this is pretty amazing in the first place. All of this takes 30 days, by the way.
The pain that Henry must have been in.
The pain.
Courage to go through that kind of operation.
There ain't a screen with Netflix up there, the boredom, you know what I mean? So this is an amazing operation. And I think it might even be more amazing than Bradmore's usually given credit for, because I don't even know if it leaves a scar or a significant scar. It's often said, everyone's seen the portrait of Pudding Bowl Henry V that's in profile, right? You've got that run of portraits of English kings that are front on, and then you have this one in profile. And you often hear it said, well, that's because he had a hideous scar running down one side of his face from the arrow wound he took at Shrewsbury. Maybe so, but no other source mentions it. Nobody says, Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, the vanquisher of the French, the bringer of justice to England, old Scarface. Nobody says a thing about it. And it's quite possible the reason that portrait, the original of which is in the Royal Collection, is in profile, it's 16th century, so it may have just been copied from a medal or a coin.
Yeah.
Maybe there was no scar, because don't forget, this is John Bradmore, who could do the eye bag surgery and not leave a scar like that. So could he have performed plastic surgery? This is all speculation. It doesn't really matter. I think what matters in terms of the political history of Henry's reign and the psychological history of Henry's reign is the kid's 16 years old. He shouldn't have survived the initial wound. Shouldn't really have survived the operation, but he does. And so he stood down from duty in Wales for a little bit to recuperate, and he goes off on pilgrimage to Canterbury, to the shrine of Thomas Becket, to Walsingham, to the Shrine of Our Lady, the sort of little house, the recreation of Nazareth in Walsingham, that's such a popular shrine. And I think, I can't prove this, but you can only prove it by looking at his future actions. He acts from this point on like he's a man with a sort of divine purpose. Like he believes he's been saved for a reason. And this reason he eventually discerns in this mission which he will relentlessly pursue to have justice, as he sees it, for in France, for what's been taken away from the Plantagenet family, all the Plantagenet lands in France. I should say it's purely speculative and psychologically speculative to root that in Shrewsbury, but I don't think it's unreasonable.
I totally agree. It's a near-death experience. He almost dies, and he almost dies. He almost dies twice, right. And he comes through. And he does seem like someone who genuinely believes he was saved, and this is his mission.